Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Representative Brianna Thomas. I'm the newest one of the batch. I think I was minted a whopping 120 days ago. If I'm unfamiliar to you, that's because you did not elect me. So we'll start doing what you can this year. Please feel free to do so. As a freshman legislator, I can tell you that this may be one of the worst jobs I've ever had. In terms of wages, hours, and working conditions, none of those are great. But it's worth it. I get to serve some of the best people in the House and the Senate. And when we tell you that we're the fighting 34th, we're not kidding about that. This was a really tough year. We had a governor that made things a little more challenging than what we would have expected, but we got a lot of policy work done, and I'm really, really proud of that. With the $16 billion budget hole in front of us, the amount of actual work and actual legislating that we got done was not insignificant. Whether it was protecting trans kids in schools, or making sure that when the government takes your land, they have to pay you fairly to find a new place to put your business or your home. We actually got quite a bit of work done, and I mostly got things done and look very smart and capable because of these two right here. So please deserve with them, and I'll hand it over to John.
Brianna is excellent at false modesty. She deserves all of our gratitude for stepping into the job at a really difficult time and doing an absolute stellar performance. In spite of, yes, what she's correct to say, it's an extremely difficult session. The hours were insanely long, and the emotions were right at the surface a lot of the time. But we did get out of there, I think, with a pretty decent set of outcomes. The biggest challenge, of course, was the budget. Something like a $16 billion shortfall. It's hard to say with precision what the shortfall is because of what do you count, what do you not count, but that's over 4 years. Our approach all session long was we're going to balance the budget with a balanced approach. We're not going to do cuts alone. We're not going to do taxes alone. We're going to do a combination of the most responsible mix of those things that we can find. So we ended up, it was pretty close to 50-50, about 7 and change in cuts, about a little shy of $9 billion in taxes. None of the cuts are easy. None of the cuts are without impacts to people, but we tried to focus on things like delaying benefit increases that we had already authorized, like for things like child care, that we had really significant increases in child care slots that were scheduled to come online in the next few years, and we just couldn't afford those, so we had to delay those considerably. A few other benefit increases that we had to delay. Some really significant reductions. We closed a prison, we closed 4 Department of Corrections reentry facilities, reductions to community colleges, reductions to 4-year institutions, across the board cuts to the big state agencies, and more. Of the taxes that we passed, we tried to focus those taxes on, when we were taxing individuals and households, to focus on the very wealthiest people in the state. We did not pass wealth tax, which got a lot of support and attention, but the governor made it very clear he was against that. So instead, we increased the estate tax and we increased the capital gains tax, which are existing taxes that really only fall on the very, very wealthiest people in the state. And then beyond that, we raised business taxes with a focus, again, on the largest businesses with the most ability to pay. So the single largest increase in revenue comes from a surcharge on the business and occupation tax for large businesses that gross over $250 million. We think there's about 100 to 140 or so that will pay that. They're very unhappy about it. You may read about that in the news, but we figured it made sense to focus on the largest businesses, not small businesses that do have a hard time getting off the ground. So obviously the governor was very new to his job. If you want some behind the scenes insights, we had a lot of tension with the governor. We had some very things with him. I will say that his, for somebody who's been in office as Attorney General of the state of Washington for 12 years, he didn't know very much about state government, or the state government, and that presented to be a real challenge as he was sort of learning in real time, which is great, but also opining on things that he didn't really understand yet, and that became an obstacle. I will say to his credit, he did sign in the law basically everything that we sent him. There were some small vetoes of line items in the budget, but no significant vetoes, in spite of many things that we were, I wonder if he might veto. So, to his credit, that is regulated, and we will continue to work to have I'm confident that we will head into the next session from a better starting point than we did in this session. Why don't I pause there? Over to Emily.
Hi everyone, Emily Alvarado, your newest state senator. As you remember last time we all got together, I was a state representative when Joe Wynn went off to go lead the Department of Commerce. I was appointed to this seat and it's been an absolute pleasure to fill it and to represent you in Olympia. And I can't wait to answer some questions later about what's the difference between the Senate and the House, get behind the scenes. At the highest level, Joe covered the operating budget really well and how challenging this year was because of the budget. We also passed a transportation and a capital budget, so those are the other two budgets. And transportation was interesting and has some interesting aspects to it. There was an increase in the gas tax. People may have seen that making headlines. That was the key way that we're getting revenue for transportation. As you all may know, transportation projects are very expensive right now. Costs are going up and it's harder to deliver. So as a strategy to help make sure we have preservation and maintenance and things like operational ferries, which matters a lot to this district, we had to get some revenue there. The gas tax is one place where we got it. We also have first time operating dollars are going straight over to the transportation budget. That's new and will be ongoing to help make sure that we can have transportation operating. I'll say from a personal perspective, I'm a little disappointed with our underinvestment in multimodal investments in the transportation budget. I thought we could have done better there, but we really focused on completing projects. There was a focus on the ferries, on preservation and maintenance. The capital budget is the most joyful of all, seriously. It is the happy budget where we make investments in infrastructure across the state, and we had less constraints in the capital budget. And I would say what we did, which I'm really proud of, is we made record investments in housing across the state of Washington, $780 million of investments through the Housing Trust Fund and other measures in housing. We know that housing affordability is at crisis levels across the state, so making those investments that span from urban to rural, from homeless to seniors, is going to be really important for our state. And happy to talk later about some of the district-specific investments that we were able to make too in the capital budget. So those are those two budgets. I'd say also at the highest level, as Rep. Thomas said, we were able to pass some important policy, and we also made some really key investments. So you'll hear out and about, or maybe you read in the newspapers, some critiques about us raising taxes. Well, I just want to remind us what those resources go to. We made over $1 billion investments in public schools over the 4 years, which includes one of the most significant investments we've made in special education and a lifting of the arbitrary cap of how many students are served in special ed, which is a step forward. It's not the end game, but it is a meaningful step forward. We made some investments in like the regular operating costs for school. That is important, a couple $100 million in operating costs for schools. We also helped to make local levies go farther. This is a controversial part that we did, but so in a place like Seattle, when we can better leverage the levy that we have, that brings in $23 million additional dollars to Seattle public schools, and we made an investment in schools that are unable to pass levies with another $200 million to those schools. So overall, over the 4 years, $1.2 billion, I think, in public schools. We also held harmless some of the critical investments or made increased investments in areas where people are particularly vulnerable. I would say especially vulnerable in light of what's happening at the federal level, and I'm sure we'll go into that conversation later. But we had to backfill some funds to make sure we weren't closing shelters across the state, and we held harmless a lot of the homeless services that we have in Washington. We made additional investments for immigrant and refugee communities, knowing that folks are particularly vulnerable right now. With food assistance that's struggling at the federal level, we made additional investments in food assistance to make sure we weren't cutting senior meal programs and some food bank support. So those are in core services. We tried to make sure we weren't going backwards, even though we made some really difficult cuts. And then when it came down to the state workforce, we did not go forward with furloughs, and we maintained our commitment to our state employees. And I think at a time when the feds are on an all-out assault on the public workforce, we held our commitment to our workforce, knowing that state workers deliver public services. And if we were to cut workers, we're really cutting services, so we didn't do that. So that's a little overview of some of the investments, and be fun to take questions.
I'm reminded that I did not introduce myself. I'm Joe Fitzgibbon. I'm one of your state representatives. I am in my 15th year as representing you in Olympia, and I'm in my 3rd year serving as the House Majority Leader, which means I get to do a lot of things, the biggest of which is spend time with the operating budget.
Joe was 10. He was pretty young though. I'll tell you what, if you have questions, if you'll just raise your hand and I will point to you as soon as I see you, and I see Alexandra, you want to speak loudly and we can repeat it if we...
Sure, Alexandra Thompson, and I am super progressive. I'm active on Facebook, and one of the Facebook pages I follow is the Washington chapter for parents' rights in education. And it's kind of like I just kind of go there to see sort of what they're talking about, and they're absolutely furious that you've gutted the parents' parental rights bill. And of course I don't agree, but it's really hard to read through their comments because they don't really give great examples of how you get it. I've done some reading about how the new version of that parental rights bill had to do it. It was not in following state law, and you made some adjustments to that. But what I was hoping from you is like maybe one example of the change that was made that I can sort of keep in my mind and sort of push out those other voices about global war.
So the question is the parental rights bill that was passed late, I think.
It was passed and then it was amended.
Yeah.
But you got it, apparently.
Okay.
But what did you got?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the parental rights, so there's an initiative to the legislature in 2024 under our state constitution. There are multiple ways that voters can bring a measure forward to become law. There's the usual way is an initiative that people where they get 400,000 signatures and then it goes onto the ballot. An initiative to the legislature is slightly different. That's when they get 400,000 signatures, submit it, and the legislature has 3 choices once there's enough signatures. You can either pass it exactly as submitted, you can ignore it, and it goes to the ballot for the voters to vote up or down on, or the legislature can write an alternative and let voters choose between the 2 alternatives. There were 6 of these in 2024, 3 of which we passed, 3 of which we did not pass, and which went on to be defeated overwhelmingly on the November ballot in 2024. You remember this? The Parents' Rights Initiative 2081 was one of the ones that we passed in the law. We were very intentional about this. We knew it had significant problems, and we thought it made more sense for us to enact it, spend some time seeing, how school districts chose to interpret the law so that we could come back in 2025 and correct some of the things that were wrong with it. It was very poorly adapted. They basically cut and pasted the Louisiana law, which is not very good, statutory construction. To your question, Alexandra, one place that I think was really important that because it's not just about parents' rights, it's also about what are the rights of students. And, in a perfect world, those interests are always growing the same direction, but we know that that's not always the case. We clarified the privacy rights of students in our public schools if they have a health issue, like perhaps a mental health issue, or perhaps they talk to a teacher about how they think maybe they're trans, or maybe they're gay, and they haven't, figured out how to talk with their parents about that yet. We clarify that the teachers don't have to tell the parents about that conversation. To me, that's the most basic protection for students that is a part of House Bill 1296, which is the bill that we passed. Very contentious. Republicans really hated this bill. But that, I think, for us was a pretty straightforward thing that, there are kids who do not feel that they are in a place where they can tell their parents what's going on with their health.
Was that part of the initiative to have?
The initiative said in a very sort of vague and unclear way that parents have the rights to any medical information that the school has about their kid. But they didn't repeal the existing laws that protect that information. So you ended up with two laws on the books that were basically in conflict, which is one of the reasons why I think really got a lot of such challenges. And we had two different laws that said different things. And so what the initiative that was enacted in 2024 said parents can have any medical information that the school has about their kids. And the bill that we passed this year said, no, in some cases that should be private.
Are there other questions?
And I appreciate that policymaking is another sport. It's an imperfect sport. It is a blood sport. And it's a bit of a blood sport, making policy. But we were on that floor for almost 13 hours. Right? And so I understand there's going to be some disappointments, but listening to hate speech 3 minutes at a time until 2 or 3 in the morning for 13 hours, that's our field of battle. Right? That's the best that we can be expected to do in a situation where folks are more than willing to do violence to our children. So I appreciate that it's not perfect, but we did the best we could.
Just a few other pieces on this is, one, when the initiative to the legislature passed last year, it passed and the leadership was very clear that if challenges arise in the school where teachers don't know how to follow the law because the inconsistencies and the ambiguities that we thought existed were actually panning out, that we would come back and fix it. So there is a line of thought by folks who are opposed to the changes that we made saying, well, it was a trick or a gotcha. There are no tricks in gotcha. I think Democrats were very clear that if we were going to pass this, we were going to fix things if they didn't work. And they didn't work. There were clear teachers, health professionals embedded in schools who were contacting OSPI saying, we don't know how to follow this law, and the follow-up legislation was intended to make that more clear. I should also say, when they say gutted, no parental rights were taken away. The follow-up legislation did not remove or take away any rights from parents. All it did is clarify when rights are in conflict, How do school administrators follow up? And what does accountability look like with those schools when they're either not following the law or they can't? And what are the roles of teachers in those cases? And then, as Joe said, they made it really clear that students have rights too, and it enumerated what those are. So I would say held harmless parental rights, cleared up ambiguities, made sure we are clear that kids and children matter, and hopefully there'll be more clarity for teachers and school districts.
So got it, it's not. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I've got a couple, but I'll start with the one that relates to climate. Our state has been in the lead on green energy, solar, wind. The problem it appears to be is the transmission lines. So you can generate a lot of solar energy in Moses Lake, etc. But if you don't have the transmission lines, you're not going to get it to where it's needed. And apparently Bonneville controls that, if I understand correctly. So how can the state, and with the present administration, they're not going to make it easier for Bonneville to transmit clean energy because they're anti-clean energy. So is there anything the state can do to deal with this issue and help get the green energy where it needs to be?
And I guess I would say, was there any action we took this year in particular to help that issue of clean energy and transmission?
Yes, great question. So we had a bill to try to make several improvements to how transmission gets built in the state. It would have set up a new state transmission authority, essentially a state agency to manage that and identify where the needs were and make sure it gets built. And then to simplify the permitting process for building those transmission lines, which is I think that's the biggest barrier, besides the one that you mentioned with the federal government, to getting that built. The bill did not come together in the end. Tribal governments were very opposed to the bill, to improving the permitting process. They didn't like that part. So that part fell out, and then the part that remained, the new agency, it just didn't quite have the support to get through the House in the end. It was pretty expensive. We're nervous about things that cost money. And I think there was a sort of an open question about how much is that really going to help relative to, if we still have this problem with the federal government. So, in the Northwest, the Bonneville Power Administration, which Elizabeth mentioned, is the power marketing agency. They sell the electricity that's generated on the dams in the Columbia River and the nuclear plant in the Tri-Cities. And they have not been building new transmission. They're under a lot of pressure by utilities to keep rates really low, which makes them very cost conservative in terms of not willing to take on new projects, even if those projects are really needed for our clean energy transition. And now they have the federal government telling them just don't do anything that helps renewables. So that's a real problem. I will say one thing that's interesting is, our delegation in Congress, especially Senator Cantwell, have always been very strong defenders of EPA, and their patience has kind of run out, and they said you really need to get your acts together when it comes to building transmission. So I would say we didn't really make progress on the transmission side of things, but we know that's a huge problem, and that's going to be, I think, we'll definitely be bringing back the bill to create transmission authority next year and try to drill down a little bit and how we can make sure that it is impactful.
What were the objections of the tribes to the permitting changes?
Yeah, so the bill would have allowed the reconductoring of transmission lines, which is basically when you're not building a new corridor, but you're taking an existing transmission line and putting higher capacity wires up so it can move more power. And it would have exempted those types of projects from the State Environmental Policy Act. Trying to very protective, and we're more protective than ever this year of the State Environmental Policy Act, which is a tool that they use and that other people use to slow down and stop projects that they don't like, and they were worried that they would lose that leverage. I don't agree with that, but I was never seen.
Okay, he's the energy guy. Are there other questions? I know Elizabeth has, but otherwise I want to, yeah, why don't you do here and then, yeah, you first.
So I read and heard about this mental health facility that was built and it's supposed to finish next month. There's no money to operate it. And I'm just curious what the heck happened to that. That seems really.
The state reviewed a facility, behavioral health facility in North Seattle.
I believe so, yes. Yes, it's supposed to open next month, but there's no money to staff it and the locations.
I know that we added, I don't have a super detailed, so the question was about a new, a couple years ago, the legislature funded a new behavioral health teaching hospital in Northgate, essentially run by the UW, and they've had a lot of trouble getting it fully staffed and getting the patients in, to receive treatment there, and also to train the behavioral health workforce there because of insufficient staffing. And a lot of this has been a disagreement with King County over who is responsible for the public defense costs for the people who are involuntarily. I mean, this is like not a strictly voluntary facility. Like some people are sent there under involuntary treatment, and there's large costs to whichever government has the responsibility of representing those people in court. We did put some money in the budget for King County to staff. There's this public defense issue is a huge problem for local governments across the state. There's just not enough lawyers, they're not paid well enough, they can chase those. So I think we'll see some improvements there, but I'm sorry, I wish I had like a very detailed
My
answer.
impression was that this is a completely new building, brand new building. It's totally empty and it's just going to sit there until money is found to staff it. Is that the same?
Yeah, I mean, we both work to staff it, and there are mental health facilities in the state. There's a big one in Vancouver that, because it's not staffed, we kind of mothballed it in order to save money. So it's a different situation than we had for most of the last 10 years, where we had a real shortage of these beds. Now so many people have come online that we think the same.
So it's not money, it's the, well, it is money.
It's the money and it's sort of timing.
Okay, so how long is it going to be for?
I don't know that. I'm sorry.
So we're not broke.
The
Yeah.
crystal ball is, Patricia, did you have, Patricia?
So we always think that we live in this bubble and our state legislature, things are going to be just great and fine in Washington. But I'm sort of hearing some, between the parents' rights initiative and things like that, that the MAGA mind is getting into the legislature. Can you talk about how that's affected you and what we can do?
Can you please repeat the question?
I'll start. I think bit of the question was, we've lived in a progressive bubble here in Washington for so long. We've been true to the blue for years and years and years, and some of our comments are illustrating the fact that that hasn't been the case this year. I will tell you, it was a terrible year to be a freshman. This was a really bad first year. We were broke. We were having challenges at the federal level. And I came in as one of 24 freshmen in the House of Representatives. We had 10 on the Democratic side, 13 on the other side, and one guy who kind of lives in between. So a quarter of the body was new. And that brought new energy. That brought new rhetoric. That emboldened leadership on both sides of the aisle to really make their point. And so while the 10 of us on our side of the aisle were trying to figure out how to govern as quickly as we could and hold true to our values and represent our districts and work together and actually pass laws, you had the same team on the other side doing exactly the same, right? And so when we're sitting on the floor and people say trans women aren't women, and they say that, global warming is a myth, and we litigate the value of vaccines. Like, that's what this session was. It was a back to basics, us versus them sort of narrative, issue by issue by issue, and very few issues were missed. The value of affordable housing. You know, Senator Alvarado here failed to mention that she has stabilized the rent. But that was a pretty big deal this year when you're having arguments with folks about whether or not corporations should be able to own hundreds, maybe thousands of single-family homes, while we still have a homelessness crisis. So that was definitely, at least, again, it was my first year, guys. Maybe next year will be different. But it was a pretty rough and tumble dynamic to start out with.
Yeah, so a few thoughts. One, I think you are seeing, I think especially in the House, though I wasn't there this time, there was more of a recognition that people seemed emboldened from the other side to be able to say things that I don't think they would have said out loud several years ago. Things that are hateful and more racist, and I think you saw rhetoric that really looked and felt different this time. I think also, you know, it's challenging because what we had to do is to put forward an alternative vision. And I think that's what's really important right now. It's important that we're not only against something, but that we're for something. And we can show what we stand for. We can show a path towards a better future for our kids and our families. And it's very hard to put that vision forward when you're $16 billion in the hole. So balancing the emboldened rhetoric and trying to put forward a vision at a difficult time becomes hard. And I think we did have some meaningful policy wins. We did continue to make progress on gun reform. I think that's important. And that's where we get to live our values. We passed a permit to purchase bill. Very important legislation has been in the works for a long time, and we get to say, here is our vision for public safety, and it includes common sense laws that helps us make sure we don't have guns in our street that are harming our kids and our families. We made progress on recycling. We could probably talk more about that, but having more of an opportunity to have recycling statewide with responsibility on producers, that's good, and it'll help reduce costs here in places like Seattle. We were able to move forward on my legislation that stops price gouging in housing so that renters don't get 10% rent increases and manufactured homeowners don't get over a 5% rent increase, help with affordability, a positive vision moving forward. So I think we did some big things. It was harder, and I think our collective challenge is when times are tense and when budgets are tight, what does our proactive policy vision look like so that we can keep making progress and keep showing optimism in spite of all of it?
Okay, Elizabeth, this time,
Okay, I have a softball question for Emily. You mentioned the difference between the House and the Senate. So my question was, how was the culture of the Senate different from the culture of the House, or was there no difference?
It is very different. Part of it, I think, comes from the fact that there are just half as many people. And having fewer people means it's easier to organize folks, it's easier to stay on time, it's easier to get out earlier, and so you get some sleep, and sleep actually really helps. If you see what's happening in the news right now, with the, pulling an all-nighter and what that meant for various legislators on the federal level, it's a big deal. So I think having fewer people actually makes it easier to keep our tent together. I mean, let's be real. There are a lot of Democrats in the legislature, and that's a blessing. And it's a big tent, and people have diverse perspectives within the Democratic Party. And so, you know, trying to keep everyone rowing the same direction on very complex things becomes hard. I think it's easier in the Senate just by virtue of having fewer people, honestly. So I would say that's the biggest difference. The other difference is because there are fewer people, not me because I was new, but almost everyone is in some kind of leadership capacity, which means they're busier doing something, running the budget, running a committee as a chair. And in the House, because there are so many more members and fewer people are in leadership, people have more time, and with time comes chaos. And just that chaos can really upend the future of a bill that you thought was a slam dunk all of a sudden became more challenging. You know, there are tense times, and so being able to roll with fewer people actually helps to get things done. But I will say, even in the Senate, we had one of the largest new classes that we've ever had. And so you're seeing a younger Senate. You're seeing more than ever senators who were House members, which also changes the culture of the Senate too, because people are used to more of the collaborative approach that happens in the House, whereas people in the Senate used to say everyone's an independent consultant. That vibe is changing because so many people have newly come over from the House.
I am not in the Senate, but I have one observation I've heard over the years that I think is just funny and rings a little bit true to me. The House is like a symphony orchestra, and the Senate is jazz. People are just doing their own thing a little bit more, whereas the House is, because it's large and like, you know, really as a function of size, like is a little bit more like hierarchical and process and takes longer to get things done.
Okay, Kimberly. And then
Kim, so juvenile detention overcrowding, nothing passed out of the House on that, and it was called a moral failure by members of both parties per the Seattle Times article. Can you address that?
Sure. Juvenile detention, we didn't take action on it. Right now, we have young people in inhumane conditions under the state's control. And I signed a letter that said that was a moral failure. I stand by that. It absolutely is. I was very fortunate to be part of a team of legislators that, well, if we didn't stay up till 2 in the morning trying to get a deal on these bills that we'd coupled together, that would not only take a new direction on how we address juvenile detention and sentencing, but also allow these children to move out of their current conditions. And we married them together on purpose, right? This isn't an ecosystem that we're trying to move. But we did that just the day before a cutoff. And a cutoff is a cutoff is a cutoff in Olympia. That time is very, very real. And when you're counting votes, you know, it's prudent to bring things to the floor that can pass when you're in leadership. And you just couldn't votes between both sides of the aisle. And so, you know, talking about a big tent and all sorts of different perspectives being inside the tent, we are not a monolith as Democrats. We do not share priorities the same way at the same time. And that's what happened this year. Not everybody was on the same page of music, to use the music metaphor. And quite frankly, we just ran out of time. It was one of those people that was up till 2 in the morning. I can tell you, I was heartbroken. And then I was nonverbal, which is always very concerning for my colleagues. When I stop talking, they know I'm really very upset. And so I had a whole day where I just didn't say a word because I didn't know what to say. We just failed those kids.
I mean, at one level, little higher. I mean, I think the situation that we have is that there are horrible conditions, and we need to make sure we're treating young people better, and we need to make sure that we have more diversion opportunities so that youth who don't need to go to jail aren't going there, and who have other opportunities for diversion and support. So there are two pieces here. One is making places safe, and in some cases that might mean moving young people to more intensive settings. And it's also about diverting young people to lesser intensive settings. And so when you hear Rep. Thomas say there was a package of bills, there was legislation by Senator Braun and by Senator Wilson, and in the Senate, the vision is both of those moves so that we work on diversion at the same time that we're saying there might be some young people who need to move to adult prison in order to make that other facility safer. But those two things need to happen at once. We were able to take action on both, and because of some of the reasons you heard, the House wasn't. So I think we need to continue to look at juvenile justice in a holistic way, and hopefully we can take action on all of the components.
Yeah, the core problem, one of the core problems, the overcrowding problem, there's two juvenile detention facilities left in the state, one in Issaquah, and then the one where the real problems are is called Green Hill School, and it's down in Chehalis. And that's one where we have young people up to age 25 in juvenile detention, which we passed a bill a few years ago, finding that, that there's evidence that there's more rehabilitative value in the juvenile rehabilitation system than in Department of Corrections. And so we have some people who would have aged into adult prison in JRA, but we don't have enough physical space for all of them. We don't have enough staffing at Green Hill School, which is the cause of the really concerning and unsafe conditions, unsafe both for the young people who are detained there and for the workforce there. So the bills that we had, as both Emily and Brianna said, one of the bills would allow the Department of the Juvenile Rehabilitation Administration to transfer more young people to prisons, to adult prisons. That was one piece. That was the piece to address the overcrowding in the short term. And then there was this other bill, which was the one that turned out to be controversial in the House. I think it passed pretty much out of the Senate, but it did not have the votes to pass in the House. That would have said for the less serious offenses that the law requires young people who were convicted of those offenses to go into custody, into state custody. For less serious offenses, the judge would have to make an affirmative finding that it was in the interest of that young person and the safety of the community to put them in state custody. And if they did not make that finding, then those people would be on home confinement, essentially. That's the diversion, diverting them out of these overcrowded facilities into home confinement for less serious offenses, where they would still have access to the programming, but not be in these overcrowded facilities. And we had, all the Republicans were very opposed to this, and we had enough more conservative Democrats who really didn't want to be accused of having let juvenile offenders out of jail or out of prison. There weren't enough of them willing to vote for the bill to have the support to pass. And so we weren't able to pass that, which meant we weren't able to pass the more conservative bill, which would send more kids into Department of Corrections prisons. I would say it's one of the most frustrating things. One of the biggest disappointments, for me out of this session was the failure of this package of bills. And I got a text from Brianna like a day or two after this happened, and she was like, "How do you keep coming to work when something like this happens?" Yeah, it's not easy because we really felt like there was a moral, we had a moral responsibility to young people who have been convicted of serious crimes, but to not have them in incredibly dangerous and overcrowded places. There were a couple things that we did do that will make a difference. won't necessarily solve the full problem. We did, with money in the budget, make investments in there's a vacant wing at an adult prison in Aberdeen that we're going to convert to a facility for not juveniles, but those 18 to 25-year-old folks. So some people will be able to go there once that facility is fully up and running. And then we also passed a bill that will, one of the things that we've found unintended consequence of our law on prison riots. If you get in a fight at a prison, that's a pretty serious offense, and that often means that people have their sentences extended a long time. And that's been enforced with a pretty heavy hand in these juvenile facilities. So you have kids who get in fights. Yeah, two people will get in a fight at lunch. Obviously, we'd rather not that happen, but should that be a felony? Should that keep you in state custody for another decade? So we passed a lot of reform, the application of the prison riot offense to young people in JRA. So again, that won't solve the problem, but we're very cognizant of the need to do more there.
So how do you guys get along? I mean, how do you?
With each other?
Yeah, how do you
Great.
coordinate with each other?
Yeah, we've been talking about tents and budgets and all of that. It strikes me that the overall fabric of this.
I was serious about my question. But go ahead and answer it. I'll ask it afterwards.
The overall fabric is the Constitution of the state. And as I understand the preamble of the Constitution, says that the state will fund K through 12, and the court was agreed with that. And in 2019, I guess, that the budget is about 50-50 education. Now it's 42.3. I notice, and I could be wrong here, 5 school districts are in, I guess it's a neat word for bankrupt. And we have 14 that are on warning, and I think that's a neat way to say Moody's is downgraded. It's a constitutional mandate. What's your proposal to combine with the Constitution, getting the schools funded, and, by the way, Seattle's $93 million short? All the above.
Well, I'll just start. I'll start by saying K-12 public schools is our paramount duty, and constitutionally we have to fund basic education. And I think we have a lot more to do to meet that fully. Right now, I don't love using the percent of budget as the indicator of whether or not you're doing, fulfilling that duty, in part because our total dollars towards education continues to grow. It's because the whole pie is growing. Is that sufficient? No. But the resources and revenue options we have right now for funding schools are wholly inadequate. It means we have to keep going back to sales tax and B&O tax in order to pay for our public schools. And that's just not going to get us to more investment in the scale that I think is necessary. We proposed in the Senate, and we passed off the Senate floor very late, a wealth tax, which would be a new revenue source for actually funding schools that could have brought $4 billion to the table over the next couple of years, so we could look at more progressive sources to fund our schools. Again, it doesn't make sense to look at sales tax, the most regressive sources to fund schools. So I think, A, we have a revenue problem. We can't get to the scale that we need to fund our schools without looking at new kinds of revenue. As was mentioned earlier, the governor took some of those revenue options off the table, said he would veto it. We tried to look at property taxes. I know people have strong feelings about property taxes. Even that didn't go forward to help local governments with their budgets. So we're really hamstrung on what we can do absent new revenue sources. My hope is that we can bring meaningful progressive revenue to the table so we can fund our public schools. As I said earlier, we did take more steps to make more investments in schools. It's not enough though. And we need to do more, but it's the money problem. I mean, as you said, it's about half of the budget. Looking at that other half, I don't see a path to cut the money out of that part of the budget to fund our schools. I'm a parent, I have kids in public schools, I'm a child of public school educators, I recognize it's our priority. There's not a path to cut our way to the school investments that we need, because then we'd be cutting healthcare, food for older adults, we'd be laying off our workforce in the state that provides key services, we'd be defunding Department of Corrections. So absent a new revenue source, I just don't see how we get there.
This is a petty question, but.
Oh, come on.
It is, but I just have to say it. When watching TV in the legislature, one of the biggest sponsors is the charter school. I mean, that just, it bothers me. Because the alternative, the big thing is, let's get rid of public education. Let's just educate those kids who can afford to. Are they giving money to legislators? Are the charter schools out there giving money to you guys to make it breeze the, it's petty, it's a nasty question, but it just made me angry every time I would see sponsored by the charter schools.
Yeah, we don't control who sponsors TDW.
It's
TDW is like a quasi, it's not really a state agency, it's like a public-private partnership. We do pay them some of their bills, but they get sponsors, they tend to get sponsors from entities that have a lot of business in front of the legislature. Because they know that people who watch it are, people who are interested in state government. We have probably, I would say, not one of those, the most restrictive law on charter schools of any state. We have a hard cap on the number of charters there can be, and they don't get very much public funding. They're always complaining about how they don't get public funding. What they always say they want is just equity. They want the same per student funding that public schools get, and we have not.
I mean, just to say, charter schools are public schools, but they are restricted in this state. They are public and they take kids and they don't charge resources, but they are very restricted. And whoever sponsors, the PUDs sponsor a lot of TDW too, so that doesn't direct what happens in London.
And I'll also say, we're on TBW, so we don't really see the ads. Circling back to Anne's question about how we all get along.
How do you coordinate? It sounded like you sent him a note and say, hey, what did you, and
What the heck is happening, Joe? No, normally I just find them when I've gotten over my skis and I can solve my own problems, and I'm lucky that my ski makes the house majority of the like, that's kind of awesome. Gotta be honest with you, it's very handy. I also got quite a bit of trouble this year for spending an inordinate amount of time in the Senate. I would just run across to the other chamber and watch my teammate go, or send her notes, or send her loving text messages. They were like, you can do it, and all up. Quick, govern them into oblivion with Emily. She's very, very, very good. I don't think all districts are this lucky. Like, I think we all share very, very similar core values. We all share a pretty decent sense of humor. We all share the willingness to serve, and we're not ever voting against each other, I don't think. And there's a lot of districts in Washington that can't claim that. I would also say I think my teammates are really good at letting everybody do what they're best at. So there's not a lot of competition with them.
Yeah, division of labor is the key. I mean, we do get along. I think we're all progressives and happy to support each other when we have big things on the list. But there are a lot of districts in the state where you would not see three legislators sitting on the stage together unless you force them to. I think it really helps that we just kind of I know that when housing comes up, both my teammates are on the housing committees. I care a lot about housing, but I know I don't have to spend a lot of brain cells on it because my team states have it down. And that's really when you get a lot of it. There's so many issues in Olympia that it is not possible to be an expert in everything. Some people come in and they think, I'm going to be an expert in everything. Then they always fail because you can't, there's too much. So if you have people that you can look to, whether it's your seatmates or a committee chair, or if it's not a committee chair, it's a different person who, you trust their judgment, and you say, okay, on the foster care system, I know I'm going to look to this legislator because they know what they're talking about there, and I know they have what I'm being straight for, and that is really what builds trust, both within the delegation and with other legislators. It's like, you got that, I'll interview.
I kind of want to go back to the schools question for a second, just because it really is one of the most important things that we do in Olympia. And I'm disappointed that we weren't able to do more. And the Senate budget, which put forward a new payroll tax and a new wealth tax, like really significant new taxes on some of the wealthiest people and corporations in the state, would have created a pathway to more meaningfully fund our schools. And I really do, I do not think there is a way forward for us to deeply fund our schools without rethinking the way that we tax in our state. There just isn't a way. Even the Republicans couldn't come up with a cut budget way that fully funded schools to the level that we need. So we need to all stand together and figure out what it looks like to defend a new approach to taxing that gets the revenue that's necessary to invest in our future. And we faced so many obstacles when the Senate put forward that proposal, whether it was from the Seattle Times or from the governor or from whatever groups out there. And so we need to build a movement that says we have enough resource in this state to have world-class public education. That is just a matter of taxing and will. And then yes, are there policies and better things we can do to improve instruction and improve educational outcomes? Absolutely, but we shouldn't be in a position where we're pitting HCC and highly capable programs against special education programs. We should be able to fund all of the programs for all of our kids in the schools, and that's going to take new taxes. Sorry. Sorry.
Are you suggesting an income tax?
I wish we had an income tax that was fair. We wouldn't be in this position. I think all of us would prefer that. But we're trying around the edges to find a legally defensible, constitutional path forward that is more fair so that we can have great schools. The thing about great schools, sorry, I'm rambling for a bit, and I'll stop. The thing about great schools is they're fabulous for our economy. Everyone will want to live in the state with the best public schools, and we can do it. It's not rocket science, it's just a matter of resource, I believe.
I'm going to call on Gail and Elizabeth once more, and then if you have any comments you want to make, Brianna. Oh, look at 5 people as well as but I saw that because you kept going back to that education. No, anyway, yeah, Melissa, I'm crying. Okay, I'm crying. Go.
First of all, thank you for your tenacity and grit in doing a very difficult job and being here this evening. Truly appreciative of the work that you do. I work to help at-risk, marginalized populations, households get connected to technology, the internet, and obtain the skills needed to access technology and the internet. And I was really just happy to read the article that came out with the state's digital navigation program. But my question for you is, and thank you for your support of the digital Speaking of how the difference in the different lens that you now are finding on the other side of the aisle is, what do you see digital inclusion, digital equity as being well understood in the legislature, regardless of which side of the aisle? Does it feel like when you say, when the words digital equity are said, is there a blank look that might indicate you don't include that?
To be honest, I've never had a conversation with a Republican about digital equity. I think that, I know my colleague, Representative Mia Gregerson from CTAC is the champion on that issue. She's part of our core budget team, and she's always made sure that digital navigators and digital equity more broadly were priorities for us. I think I understand sort of like the need, right, and how you have folks, sometimes older folks, sometimes folks from marginalized communities, maybe newer Americans. Men, sure.
No, man.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Imagine trying to send your kids to children without internet at home.
Oh yeah, no, exactly right. I think
Or being able to help
the
them
pandemic, when so many things moved online, schooling, work, everything else, like there were, therapy, right? Like healthcare treatments of all kinds had went online, and if you didn't have, if many people take for granted that internet is available and usable, and we know in really rural areas where broadband isn't there and they don't have quality connections, and this is a real barrier. And so Rep. Gregerson has really championed digital equity. I do think that one of I'll say broadly about the Republicans, they love to criticize state spending, and they don't have any examples of what they think we shouldn't be doing. And whenever you bring up a specific cut, they oppose it. They support cutting the budget in a big, non-specific way, but when we say, we had a bill to eliminate a program, which is a great program, but it didn't feel like a priority this year, that provides $2 million a year in study abroad scholarships to young people in Washington schools. And of course, study abroad is great, but we're, eliminating people's jobs, people's healthcare, making some other measures. We thought maybe that was Republicans locked up against it. How dare you take away people's study abroad? So they are not say we shouldn't be doing digital equity. And I do think that at least some of them understand that the places where broadband investments are really needed is in rural parts of the state, which they are more tend to represent. I think that what we haven't done a good enough job yet at doing is explaining what the work is of digital navigators and have some success stories to share with people like the governor to say this is the kind of life-changing knowledge that came as a result of these people doing this outreach to these people who would have not had access to the internet or to healthcare otherwise. I think that's
We're getting close to the end.
Here's one other thing I want to say, because I have talked to a Republican about digital equity, and here's one thing, is the theory that Republicans often put out is that deregulation will lead to increased access for all.
Or increased bills for all.
And so, but I will say, this is our challenge, because often our perspective is, well, actually there are significant market failures because things don't make money, like providing internet access to low-income people or folks in rural communities, and that's exactly what the role of the government is to step in where there are gaps and to ensure basic services for all. I think we have to do a better job of showing that our programs and our public services work, and that's on us to make sure that A, they do work, and then B, as Joe said, we're telling a really compelling story about what those outcomes are. But this is happening on every issue over and over again. On housing, it's, well, they just want, taxes and regulations to do things, and we just think you can deregulate I flipped that. That was the Republican talking who says you can deregulate your way to a future where everyone has an affordable home, and I don't believe that at all. And I think we see a world where that leads us is to inequality. So we need to show that our investments in housing work and that the protections we put in place make people more safe. But we're seeing it on every front now. It's the biggest argument I think you see in Olympia and more broadly. And I think it's digital equity is an example where we need to show.
But if HUD really, if the legislator felt the federal government follows through on writing a budget that slashes HUD by 40%, then how would the state, anyway, sorry.
Okay, we're gonna go, Gail and Elizabeth, you say your questions and they'll figure out how to do in less than a half, no, go ahead.
Well, actually, this should be a very short answer. So the next session is 60 days. What do you think the likelihood is that Ferguson will change his mind about the wealth tax and about the other tax on high profit large corporations?
Okay, and Elizabeth, your quick question?
Okay, mine was about, it relates to support of publishers, small publishers of newspapers. The
Okay.
Times is a great supporter of all.
That's okay,
newspapers,
that's
but I
it,
haven't-
all right. Go.
The governor's not going to change his mind about the wealth tax.
Let me answer.
He's not going to change his mind about the wealth tax. He did sign the bill charging an increased business occupation tax on the biggest businesses, the highest grossing business. We can't tax the highest profit businesses because that's income tax. And he was very opposed to the property tax. We have a cap on property taxes that's lower than inflation. So property taxes go down every year. People think that we're always raising taxes. Property taxes go down every year at the local level and at the state level. We had proposed, the Senate had proposed to lift the cap from 1% to just whatever inflation is. We proposed lifting it from 1% to 3%. Governor was just categorically opposed to anything on property taxes. That one I hope he changes his mind on when he realizes his whole thing about there's not enough cops. Well, that's a function of cities and counties not being able to balance their budgets, and their biggest expenditure is cops. So I hope he changes his mind about that. He will not change his mind about wealth tax.
Okay, apparently I didn't let Elizabeth actually ask her question,
Okay.
so ask it really quickly.
Right, there was a Senate Bill 5400, which would have taxed.
Yeah, it's the advanced computing surcharge, which is basically levied on Amazon and Microsoft. We did increase that tax, but we needed the money for the operating budget. We just did not, this is not a year that we were able to do sort of new expenditures for newspapers.
You couldn't distribute to the papers,
We needed it for schools and healthcare, yeah.
but you
So,
did at least get that tax through.
yes,
Oh, that's good, that's a step.
yes.
Okay, I want to, because we're actually over time, but, because I said I would get you out by 8 and you guys are busy, so I really want to thank you for all the work you're doing and